Hello everybody and welcome. My name is Emily Sheffield, the editor of the Evening Standard. And we are here today with a huge cast of incredible names from across the arts in London, but also from business, transport and the media. This is the Evening Standard's third recovery board, but the first to be open to a London audience. So welcome to all of you who have joined us today. We do hope you enjoy our session. I set up the recovery board in January with our business editor, Jim Armitage, so we could gather brilliant ideas about how we could not only recover from the devastation this pandemic has wrought across every sector in this great city, but how we could also build back better. How could we transform London for a much greater future? Our first recovery board was on the offices of the future, and the second on building back greener. Today is how do we help the arts recover, from live music to the West End, art galleries and our great institutions, and how we can add better diversity, use design to enhance whole areas of London. How can our infrastructure encourage people back from their homes and back out again, especially if working from home means less people coming into the city every day? I and my arts editor, Nancy Durrant, are very pleased to have Ed Vaizey here as our chair today. He was the Minister of Culture from 2010 to 2016.
Thanks very much, Emily. It's thrilling to chair this very august panel on a very important subject, which is how we help the arts recover. And also, if there are any lessons from the pandemic that we will take forward. Rebecca Kane-Burton from Lloyd Webber Theatre. So Rebecca, tell us a bit about what you think the new normal can look like.
Well, out of disaster comes innovation and creativity. And I think that's exactly what we need, what we're looking for. As I think everybody would know on this panel, there's nothing that brings people together more like culture. And my God, do we all need to be brought together again? We're sick of looking at our bedroom and lounge walls. And I know I can speak for Andrew when we look at some of the work we've led in terms of thinking about how we might run our estates better, thinking how we might collaborate in a creative way. You know, things like Zoom have sort of become a lifeblood for all of us. And I'm sure we curse it and welcome it in equal measure. But the creativity alone that has come out of this sector, whilst people have had time to perhaps think and pause and look at how they might work with others differently, that's produced other things that perhaps might not have come out of a period of sort of normality where we're all sort of running to keep up. And I think, that innovation started right at the beginning of the pandemic for us, particularly when we were looking overseas at places like Korea. Phantom of the Opera was the only show actually open and trading and the only performance happening anywhere in the world as we went into this awful pandemic. And we ourselves, obviously it was lucky for us, it was one of our shows, but could look very closely at what was happening in Korea and understand and learn from that. And I think one of the excitements that we have in a cultural sense and in how we might learn as London is how we can pull together. And I think, lives really had a kicking this year. I've always been very thrilled to work in the live sector because everything from foot and mouth or horrendous terrorist attacks has never, ever brought live to the standstill that we have experienced in this pandemic. And I think out of that comes a spirit and a resolve and an innovation that can help drive us forward. And my goodness, we see how much this city of London needs all of us.
So I'm going to stick with talking about performance before I move on to other topics. Gino Adimba from Teatr Pochodzi, you run a theatre company, so you're interested in performance. You've obviously been slammed by the pandemic. How are you looking forward to as and when we come out of this?
Thank you, Ed. I've just started my role at Teatr this week, and I've been a freelance artist for the last 18 years and a freelance writer. Yeah. And so I guess the headlines for me, and I hear so much of what's been said already. Before taking on this role, I was heavily involved in Freelancers Make Theatre Work. I was one of the founding members of that group. And I think that we cannot talk about recovery without talking about freelancers. The theatre sector and the industry is made up of over 70% freelancers. And that is not something that any of us have really taken on board before this moment. And more research needs to be done and more work needs to be done about how we really shore up the foundations of what it means for those freelance theatre workforce. That feels really important, not just in my other role as a freelance writer, but as someone who's now taking on an organization. I think alongside that, there's something for me about taking forward some of the lessons that we've learned about who might be the most vulnerable at this moment. And this goes wider than the freelancer thing. So, you know, I think only last week there was a Guardian article about how 40% unemployment currently amongst young Black people. 40%. I mean, that's not a figure you can walk away from. And so as a theatre, I'm thinking, well, how do I support young people to come into an industry that is already quite difficult for them to come into? What are the things we need to do in terms of youth employment generally to ensure that young people in London, and don't get me wrong, this is in no way a downer, because I don't think as a city you can in any way question our ability to thrive and to survive and to really be innovative in terms of young entrepreneurship and young businesses and some of the areas that we've really grown in terms of the creative sector generally, in terms of gaming. And, you know, these are things that make us stand out as a city. But I think for me, that's a big worry. It's what do we do to support young people, and how do we make sure that those foundations are in place?
I mean, Chino, obviously other things happened during the pandemic, like Black Lives Matters. Do you think that there is an opportunity, this has kind of broken open the need to tell diverse stories, and indeed the need to focus on young people who have been hardest hit by the pandemic? Do you think that is an opportunity to spring forward or not?
Yeah, I mean, that's what I mean by taking those lessons forward. And also, you know, I think one thing I will say, and this is really talking as an artist, is that we've got to trust that very thing you're talking about, Ed. We have got to trust artists to tell the stories that need to be told, and not the stories that we feel comfortable with, and not the stories that may necessarily bring in the most money. You know, we have got to create a sector and an industry that allows for lots and lots of different stories to be told. Taking on a company that is very specific in its focus in terms of British African work, I'm really aware that that means currently in the sector that I have to get businesses, and a lot of businesses even on this board, to really trust that a company like mine, regardless of size, can really tell the stories that need to be told, and that we will get the investment to do that. And that does mean supporting young artists, but it also means supporting mid-career artists and established artists. And like, I suppose the thing I pose constantly whenever I'm asked about Black Lives Matter and questions of race and diversity and inclusion and equality, certainly in terms of the arts and in terms of cultural recovery in London, the question for me comes down to, are you willing to invest? Are you willing to celebrate those who have put in the hard work already? Because they may be the key to attracting a younger workforce and a younger cultural ambassadors for this city and for this country.
I wonder whether Casely, if anywhere is going to be pioneering, it should be London, and in particularly engaging young people, new audiences, both in terms of telling their stories and seeing new performances.
Well, thanks, Ed. I think I'll just pick up on where Chino left off, really. So we have an enormous pool of energetic talent in London. If I choose a random class of arts, just to make the point, but if you think about how grime music began in London, is now a global phenomenon, etc., and that came from just kids doing things together and turning it into something. That capability to be creative in its broadest definition exists across this great city. But there's then an air gap between that capability and what I'll call the establishment, the people who've been doing the same thing essentially day in and day out for decades, possibly centuries. And it's quite interesting, again, Chino was saying about taking a Georgian building and making it, which was only open for the evening, and making it into essentially a 12-hour-a-day venue for people to do all sorts of things. Old assets have generally dominated and now are recognizing the need to reinvent. So we've got this huge pool of capability and of talent and of energy in London. We've also got, surprise, surprise, an enormous pool of technological capability. And when those two things come together, magic happens. Yet, so far through the pandemic, most of the technology that we have, possibly all of the technology that we focused on to survive, has come from somewhere else. It's Zoom, like today, it's Teams, it's et cetera, et cetera. We're not looking to say, how do we revolutionize the creation and enjoyment of music or stage or whatever, because the arts tech scene hasn't yet emerged. There's no reason why it shouldn't emerge there. And I think London has a pole position.
I want to just briefly stick with performances. Alex Beard, you've always struck me as an innovative fellow. How's and again, sort of slightly picking up Ken's challenge, you're in an old building with an old art form, I guess, with opera. How do you think you're going to adapt to the new normal, are adapting to the new normal?
Sure.
You've already opened up the Opera House to be an all-day venue as well.
Yeah, no, and don't forget ballet too.
And ballet.
But yeah, no, look, I think it's absolutely essential that major institutions are visibly part of the shared cultural fabric and do that in ways that engage new audiences and, you know, in exciting new ways. And whether that's a family festival on an all-day Sunday at the Royal Opera House, or what we're opening on May the 18th, which is the world's first hyper-reality opera experience, 15 minutes of total immersion in a TARDIS-like structure in the Linbury Theatre, or taking advantage, picking up Chino's point of the disruption of the pandemic and you know, managing to get, you know, Hannah Kendall's amazing Knife of Dawn on the main stage of the Royal Opera House, you know, which hopefully these things are not just one-offs, busking moments during a pandemic, but signals of change for the future. And I'm absolutely determined that, you know, we do our bit on that, and that we do so in a way that is what goes well beyond the boundaries of the institution. I think the freelance point is so important. You know, we may be the largest employers of artists in the country, but there are 3 times as many freelancers who work with us every year. And that network has been under massive stress. So, you know, making sure that we build strong networks that last beyond this moment of crisis, whether that's Freelancers Make Work, or whether it's Opera UK network of practitioners, or the Engender network of female creatives in opera, which we set up a couple of years ago, or the Link Artist Programme through the Yet Parker Young Artist Programme. You know, all of that is super important. So, so I mean, I'm not pretending that it's been anything other than a nightmare roller coaster journey for the most part, but there have been some extraordinary learning experiences, and I think a big opportunity for the future for London to be what only London can be, which is the most diverse, most brilliant place on the planet in which to tell stories that will just change how you feel about yourself, your place in the world, and life. Onwards.
Thank you. We've got Axel Ruger from the Royal Academy and Gabriele Finaldi from the National Gallery. So alongside the Royal Opera House as a performance space, you've got exhibition spaces, the visual arts. Axel, let's start with you. How do you think you're going to adapt? You've gone virtual with your summer exhibition. I think it's now going to be your autumn exhibition this year.
Well, of course, you know, we've all been, to a greater or lesser degree, working or dabbling in all sorts of digital initiatives before. So in that sense, that's not entirely new, but of course it has got now to a new quality. At the same time, I think also we must sort of state a certain digital fatigue. I think we all would rather be in, you know, a studio together rather than all be on Zoom in our sort of, you know, domestic spaces. So the hunger and the desire to see the real thing and to experience, you know, live theater rather than, you know, on screen, as I did yesterday of the Old Vic, and to see exhibitions, to come to the Royal Academy, to experience our spaces even, never mind what we show, but just to be in a communal space, you know, I think is so important. So in that sense, you know, we will have to figure out yet what the new sort of balance is between our digital activities and the on-site activities. What I think is, and what we as the Royal Academy really have discovered during this period and are trying to stimulate and make use of, is really this enormous amount of also creativity that the pandemic and the lockdown has really stimulated among people at home. We get record numbers of submissions for, the summer exhibition. We have a young artist summer show as well. And there is so much also, creativity that this has stimulated, and the emphasis on making and on learning how to make, and, be it crafts, be it art, be it, even baking, whatever it may be. And I think that emphasis on this and stimulating this and then also showcasing it is something that we would,
Has that changed your thinking on engagement? Has that changed your thinking on engagement and audiences in terms of, as you say, you're receiving record submissions now? Is that something you should be thinking about building on in the future?
Well, we certainly want to see, how we build on that and what reflection that will have on our program sort of going forward. And the other thing I think that I also would say is, as we're sitting here with yet another sort of group of various backgrounds, I think what we could take away from this, a greater sense of collaboration and camaraderie across art forms in London, because Alex just mentioned other sort of opera sort of organizations and networks, but actually what I would like to see going forward is a much greater connection between the Lloyd Webber theatres, the Royal Academy, the Royal Opera House, various other Chino's theatre. I mean, there is so much more potential, because over the course of the pandemic, we've also discovered how much we actually have in common in terms of, whom we want to reach, how we want to do it, our sorrows, our problems, our frustrations, not least the fact that we, and I have to say it here because I cannot resist it, that I still find it super annoying that, all the shops around me here in Covent Garden are open, and the museums and cultural institutions are not, which is just a disgrace, which also says something about still the appreciation of the arts relative to other sectors, by the government in this country.
It is completely absurd and utterly bizarre. And in fact, I was having that conversation this morning. I find it deeply depressing. But Gabriele, I wanted to ask you, I wanted to pick up on what Axel said about collaboration. I was very struck talking to South Kensington museums a few months ago, how they feel, they're all very close neighbours, that the pandemic has brought them together with the Royal Albert Hall to work together, both within their local community, but also to kind of share resources, a sort of terribly bureaucratic phrase that. Is the museum behind its four walls? Can we move on from that after the pandemic in terms of access and building on the kind of digital?
I mean, one of the significant elements of the year we've lived through is that we've had to be imaginative, we've had to be innovative, and they're all things that I think we're going to carry with us into the future, which is really important. This notion that we, will either sink together or we'll swim together, it's really important. I think that the cultural institutions in London take collaboration as absolutely the basis of everything that we do in the future. We really need to work with each other and help each other out, particularly, of course, because our audience is going to be much reduced. Many of the big museums, for sure, and I'm sure it's the case for other institutions too, we just relied very, very heavily on massive numbers of visitors coming from abroad. We've lost them for a while. They will come back, but I think it shows up how potentially we've been perhaps not paying as much attention as we should to London audiences. And of course, London it's a massive number of people, and in a sense we need to try and find things that will encourage people to kind of fall in love with London again and fall in love with our institutions and our theatres. And the risk is that Londoners sort of look outside London if they're going to take their breaks or go out for entertainment and so on. And it's really important that we find ways to kind of welcome them back into the centre of town, and that's to do with really attractive and interesting programming. It's also to do with ensuring that people feel safe. It's to do with providing a real warm welcome. It's to do, I think, with also promoting things that are free, particularly for families. We all know how expensive it is to come into, if you've got small kids and you want to spend a day in town, you can easily set yourself back a couple of £100. So just ensuring that mix of the sort of what London offers is really strongly promoted to London, for instance, to the southeast more broadly, and then of course as things as travel comes back, reaching out to all those visitors who will be coming in from abroad. So collaboration is fundamental between institutions and organisations in London. I think it's also fundamental, across borders as well. And we're a museum of European art. It's absolutely fundamental that we you carry on working closely with our colleagues in New York or wherever it is, just to ensure that sort of flow of works of art, flow of productions, flow of artists, it's getting more difficult, can continue to happen and keep London as the absolute centre of this kind of vibrant, this vibrant culture.
Leon Daniels is with us, broadcasting from a tube station. He takes the transport issue so seriously. What do we have to learn from what's going to happen in transport?
Thanks, Ed. Well, firstly, to echo Axel's point earlier, our wonderful museum, the London Transport Museum at Covent Garden, is also closed and bursting to reopen. So we look forward to that. Well, the lesson in our history, Ed, of course, is that the Victorian railways were predominantly used for leisure travel. And it was only much more recently that mass public transport was used for people commuting to and from work. And we think in the future, there'll be a much higher proportion of leisure travel on our buses, underground and other forms of public transport. And the public transport network absolutely stands ready. The really good news is not a single case of COVID anywhere on public transport network. It's really safe. One of the great read acrosses for me is that the cleaning regime that we've established on public transportation will continue long after COVID has been and gone. The public very clearly wants to see the standard of cleanliness. And I think very important that all of our venues also take that lesson. The public is expecting a higher state of cleanliness. The other thing I think that is exciting as far as transport, not only are we stood ready to bring everybody into London to our wonderful cultural venues and so on, but the other thing that we've learned across the pandemic is that not only do people come to venues, but as a result of the lockdown, the venues have taken the arts to the people. If the people couldn't come to the arts have come to the people. So the events that we can have in our squares, in our parks, and in our streets, I think are just so important, because for those people who don't quite get round to visiting museums or visiting the theatre or concerts, taking these things to the people, I think is hugely important. And if that's one lesson we've learned during the lockdown period, I think it's one we should keep going, because the public just loves to see these events taking place out in the open.
I couldn't agree more, which is slightly why I was challenging Gabriele on, is the museum, the four walls of the museum enough anymore?
Yeah, it's we see this as a really exciting opportunity to not just engage with all of the new sort of technological opportunities that there are out there, but also for us to actually address something which is long overdue, that, there are huge segments of our audiences that we haven't traditionally seen coming to museums. And what we have in V&A East, which is basically us being given the opportunity to move our vast collection centre of more than 260,000 objects, which tell the story of brilliant cultural development across 5,000 years in almost every visual medium. We're taking that collection centre from West London, where we've lost our old collection centre, and building a wonderful new collection centre in East London. But it's not to repeat that paradigm of having a collection centre which is usually filled with kind of, academics. It's to have a collection centre which is open, which speaks to the communities in East London in new ways, using technologies to animate those stories and making those objects openly accessible to the communities that fundamentally own them, that these are public collections which in the past haven't felt like they are. And we're also building a new museum, which is a gorgeous piece of architecture designed by O'Donnell and Toomey, which is on the waterfront at East Bank, which will allow us to tell global stories. If we're going to be traveling less, we want to bring those glorious stories to London, the stories of making, that making has been one of the themes of this discussion. We want to celebrate making in this bit of London that has traditionally been a space in which makers have learnt their trades before they've then gone westward to you know, for the rest of their careers. But this is a place that we want to reinvest in. It's one of the most diverse, one of the youngest bits of London, which has always been creative. And we now want to give it a space within which those dreams of young people can be realized locally.
So I'm picking up from this discussion so far, you know, it's been a horror show, the pandemic, but it has also to a certain extent been a time for reflection. But I'm going to do a slight gear change with Peter, Charlotte, Lloyd, and Kevin Ellis on business and that interaction between business and the arts. So I want to start with Peter Bazalgette.
Look, yeah, I'm going to answer a completely different question in a way, but it comes out of everything you've been saying, actually, because I'm really stimulated and excited. You know, Axel talked about coming back to the joy of live and the joy of physical, even though we've made enormous strides with digital distribution during lockdown because we've had to, and that's been very good. And Leon talked about bringing events outside to the people, and you, Ed, talked about, does it all have to be behind four walls? Look, the truth is, this summer is going to be the alfresco summer. Whether we like it or not, come rain or shine, it's going to be the alfresco summer. It's going to be outside. How is London going to respond? How is London Arts and Culture going to respond to the alfresco summer? Edinburgh Festival, we hear, is going to be mostly outdoors, or a lot of it outdoors. When I was at the Arts Council, we funded the Durham Lumiere, the Stockton International Arts Festival, the Liverpool Biennial. And what I found when I went to those places is that, and Leon touched on this earlier, those events bring people in connection to arts and culture. Half of the population would never dream, I'm sad to say, of going into a museum or going through the door of a theatre. They think it's not for them. They think maybe they wouldn't be welcome.
Totally agree.
It's a challenge for all of us, but they'll happily go to the streets where they feel they belong and be entertained and stimulated and surprised by a range of arts. So how is London going to respond to the alfresco summer? I'll issue 3 challenges to London now. One is, how can arts and culture, the arts and cultural organisations, the people behind the four walls you talk about, how can they take their stuff onto the streets?
Yeah.
We have the South Bank Festival, of course, and it does it very well. But how can London's organisation take their stuff onto the streets in new ways? The second challenge is, how can every borough in Greater London respond to this? So Barking and Dagenham has a great mayor. Sorry, he's not your party, Ed, but he has a great mayor who really believes in the power of arts and culture. And they do fantastic festival every summer. And you see people from every background mixing and enjoying arts and cultural stuff on the streets. So who can follow the example of Barking and Dagenham across all the boroughs of Greater London? My third challenge is to the Evening Standard itself. Chino quite rightly talked about freelancers and the problem of freelancers. Now on Monday, celebrating restaurants opening up and the fact that Westminster has closed down all the parking spaces to allow restaurants to open up their tables across the streets. I had lunch, I nearly froze my rocks off, but I had lunch in Golden Square and it was jolly nice and I enjoyed it. But there's one thing missing, and that was a bit of entertainment. So why can't we get the Evening Stand to set up a register of all the restaurants who would like to host freelancers who are currently out of work to do a busker gig? I call it freelance fandango. Yeah, so in the next year or two, there's this potential for an extraordinary renewal. And I hope the Arts Council is really on that, supporting all these wonderful existing organisations, some of whom are represented on this call, but getting behind the big organisations of the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. And I had no idea that today was the launch of your mayoral campaign, but you've got my vote. I thought that was absolutely brilliant, but you have actually inadvertently allowed me to segue to Lloyd Duffield. What are your, because you know the point people miss about philanthropists like Lloyd Duffield is that you don't just write checks, you influence the way people think about the arts.
Yeah, I mean, I'm privileged and have the pleasure of sitting, you know, I give a lot of time and I sit at the table of a number of these organizations, 2 of which are actually represented here, in the case of the Opera House and the Royal Academy. So I see at sort of close quarters. I mean, if we'd have been having this conversation this time last year, you know, these guys were sort of staring into the abyss, and it was a sort of near-death experience. And, you know, without, you know, sort of sparing their blushes, I mean, they've done a heroic job to sort of steer their organizations through. And, you know, I mean, we've all been in the trenches. You know, Axel and Alex, more than us, we're just trustees and ultimately responsible and liable. But these are the guys who've been sort of leading the way. They've done a heroic job. And just a couple of things I want to say. One is, you know, all this, you know, we're world leaders in the whole cultural sector. We've got enormous talent and enormous creative potential. I just want to make the sort of obvious comment, which is we can't look at the recovery of this whole sector in sort of in a vacuum outside of some very important things, which I believe need to happen urgently, which is one, the government need to tell people to start going back to work and to use their offices. Two, I'm heartened to hear that the public transport system is cleaner than it's ever been before and will continue to be so. But we need to actually build confidence for people to use the public transport system, not least because, and this I think was a huge own goal, and I don't know if we're caught in the middle of a spat between the mayor's office and number 10 or whatever, but you know, the increase and extension of the congestion charge is just not helpful when, you know, we want families to come into, whoever made the comment earlier about what it costs to come in with a family to visit a museum or to go to the theatre or to the ballet or whatever. I mean, it's just a huge cost, and I just think that was such a dumb thing to do. A, because I don't think it's going to fix the problem, and B, you know, I think there are larger political games being played, and it's unfortunate that we're caught in the middle of it. I think there's no, I don't, you know, again, I've seen this firsthand, you know, the whole embracing of technology, you know, what at the time was sort of seen initially as a sort of stopgap measure because, you know, there was no alternative. You know, today, in the case of both the Opera House and indeed the Royal Academy, and I know elsewhere as well, you know, these organisations are I think you said it or Ken said it, you know, are embracing technology not just to be a sort of add-on stopgap measure, but now are looking at putting this at the forefront of their whole offering. And you know, yes, the four walls are for the live, authentic experience, which we all passionately believe in. But for those who, you know, want to have more access to it or can't necessarily afford it or get to it, that there will be lots of other ways through technology that they can enjoy all the creative output that these organizations can produce. So I don't think they need pushing or encouraging. I think they're sort of ahead of us. I mean, Alex referred to before, you know, the middle of May, we're going to see the first hyper reality opera, and I know Axel and the Royal Academy guys are looking at stuff. So I mean, it's, you know, big change creates big opportunity.
No, I mean, the Royal Academy and the Royal Opera House had already opened up their spaces and were already obviously doing digital things before the pandemic. But Charlotte Appleyard, you engage with technology companies as part of your work. What is the thinking in terms of how the Royal Academy is going to position itself in the future and what that says for the rest of the kind of art scene?
The first thing I'll say probably won't make me incredibly popular, but I do think that my part of the industry shouldn't be squeamish about being commercial. Digital, you know, gone are the days of sponsors just wanting their name and logo on a poster and the ability to entertain clients. They all want creative solutions. And actually, that's where the WeTransfer deal came out of, is that they are actually a content platform as well as a file sharing network. And they wanted content, and we took over their landing page. I think for about 2.5 months, they were our media sponsor for the summer exhibition, or summer autumn exhibition as it ended up being. And I think that everyone's touched on the mission opportunities for digital, which are obviously sort of unimaginable. I mean, they go on forever, but actually it's an economic one as well. We have to work with different partners in order to raise money, because the fact is the cost of exhibitions goes up every year. We can't always fall back on philanthropy. We obviously are very lucky to have great benefactors, but it's not going to be enough to make us survive. So for me, the approach to sponsorship has to go hand in hand to approach to the mission. And for us, the summer exhibition is the ultimate democratic, well, meritocratic exhibition. And so why not, if anybody can enter, why shouldn't everybody see it? And we had something like 10 million unique views. Every single work in the summer exhibition rotated through the WeTransfer landing page for the duration of our show. And that's everything from a David Hockney to something submitted by a 12-year-old that they did on their kitchen table during lockdown. But it was also a financial partnership. And I think that's really important, and that mission and money do not need to be divorced. And in fact, you will make a lot more money when they're not.
So Kevin, we're kind of coming to Kevin now as the ultimate business person because he's at a standing desk. That takes you to a whole new level.
Okay, I'll give it a shot. Look, I look at it as two virtual circles. Firstly, at the macro level, right? Post-Brexit, post-COVID, there is a kind of global war, if you like, for foreign direct investment. That creates taxes, it creates jobs, it creates prosperity, it creates a lot of things we've been talking about here. The one thing that brings you to a country to invest isn't just the financial infrastructure and the like, it's the arts, it's the magnet for talent. And London has, as we've said, many of these very, very thoughtful conversations earlier on, London has the most diverse and cosmopolitan talent in the world. It's why it stands out as a global city, in spite of the fact that the UK is quite small. And therefore, I think we can't divorce the arts from business, particularly in a world where foreign direct investment is going to be the differentiator. Then you take it to a kind of more micro level. Now, I've got 11,000 employees in London. You'd have heard me boring on in the press about return to the office. Now, I accept we've all learned a lot from COVID. We've got camera performances, we're probably reaching wider global audiences for the arts. That's fantastic. But I'm with kind of the views of Peter in terms of you need footfall, whether it's alfresco or within four walls. You do need footfall. And for me to get my people back, I think we, all of us, including the Evening Standard, got to be very noisy about the fact that London's open again. Because at the moment, I've got 2,000 people in my 20 offices across the UK. You know, I've got the capacity for 6,000 on a social distance basis. People won't learn. They won't pass on information. They won't network. And the next phase is going to be mental health issues. Mental health issues are going to be a lot worse for everybody, particularly the young people that work for me, if they haven't got mates. And that means getting them back in. So I think that there's a virtual circle there. My business will benefit. All businesses will benefit if London is seen to be reopened. That's the alfresco freezing your rocks off in the street, watching the arts, eating your food. It's also getting the theatres and the museums open again. But also I think it's being noisy that they are, because I think too many people actually have got themselves into a way of life that probably isn't going to be the future. And so I think there's a real opportunity for business and the arts to come together, both in terms of the macro investment in the country for jobs, opportunity and prosperity, but also in the micro challenge of reopening the cities. Because I look out my window here at Embankment Station, I mean, it's desolate. This is like the worst kind of Sunday afternoon in winter you've ever seen. That can't go on. That won't benefit me, and it won't benefit anyone on this call. And I think we've got all got to be noisy together about it.
What are the lessons? I mean, I'm loud and proud about London being a global city. I'm not one of these people who thinks that London should somehow be ashamed of itself and leveled down. I do think that, though, that it strikes me that change was already afoot before the pandemic, and it is a cliche, but the pandemic has accelerated that change. I think we will see all our arts institutions much more conscious about who is using them and how they're using them, trying to stay open longer and in a more accessible way. I really hope as well there'll be more kind of pop-ups and spontaneous arts around London. I think the link between business and the arts can only get stronger going forward, because to a certain extent, we're all in the same boat and we have to work together to get people back into London. And I think the overwhelming message is that our saviours are living next door to us, that Londoners will save the art scene in London as they will save London business. So thank you to Emily and to Jim for convening us all together. It's been an absolute pleasure. And thank you to all of you who have all been extremely busy during the pandemic for coming together for such a stimulating discussion.
I'd also like to say, just to finish, some of you might have seen I'd picked up my phone. I was scribbling down so many ideas. And in fact, London Rising, which I actually started thinking about last summer, is about the Evening Standard, working with everyone in the city to be very loud and noisy about what we need to do to not only open but recover from this pandemic. You've given me acres of editorial, I might say, and I'm afraid you're all going to be getting emails from me. Nancy Durrant is my brilliant arts editor who also helped pull this panel together, and she and I will be having quite a long meeting. Thank you so much, all of you, and thank you to our audience.